Okay, we'll go ahead and start this session and continue to our efforts to stay on time. I have several questions that I received, and we'll go through them hopefully today. May have to save one or two of them for tomorrow. But before I start really my class, those of you that were able to be out there last night, that was just a delightful time. I'm pretty sure Junior's not in our midst, but thank you, Junior, and thank you, everybody. That was just, the weather was nice. The visit, I had some of the best visits I had all week out there, and all of the events have been very nice. If it's possible, you've gone above and beyond, but we appreciate it. I want to just get just a little running start from yesterday. I'm not going to go back into a lot of the things I brought up because they've been touched on in various classes. And as Wade goes through the Sermon on the Mount, some of them will get touched on, and that's good. But I just want to kind of get our perspective, and then I'll go into some of the questions. We talked about some of the effects of Satan's attacks. I listed purity of the church, discipline issues of the church, sexual laxity, and these three really can kind of interrelate. The MDR, marriage, divorce, remarriage. And I just ended on this one, and I don't really have a lot to say about it other than I am so thankful for the many good leaders we have in our congregations. If you are from a congregation with men that are qualified and willing to lead, you need to be very thankful to them, and you probably would do well in your Christian walk to express that. But I do find that one of the most difficult things congregations face are finding qualified men, and sometimes it's due to some of the issues that are listed just above it. And for those of you that are younger, that is a wonderful thing to have as a goal in your life, is to be able to serve the Lord in whatever way it works out. And if leadership of an official status is in the cards for you, shall we say, that's wonderful. But even if it's not, leadership is something that we are all involved in. I believe we're all leaders because there are people watching us to see how they should conduct themselves. Those of you that are teenagers, you are leaders because those little kids downstairs are watching you. And it's just something that we need to keep in mind. I also dealt with some of the ways that Satan seems to be attacking the church today. And this is going to lead into my first question. But the truth must dominate the church. Therefore, attacks on truth are attacks on the church. Sometimes the church, and I'm not really speaking about our brotherhood. I don't see this too much, if at all. But religious organizations, they get commercialized in their organization, in their programs. I do not believe the strength of the church lies in its programs. I believe the strength of the church lies in its virtue. A trendy approach to religion. We see that, and we can talk and cast stones, even though they be true stones, at other religious organizations. Worship goals, and I mentioned this, and this is going to lead into the first question that I am going to address this morning. We need to have doctrinal steadfast and spiritual discernment. This was all on the slides that I showed you yesterday. But I did receive a question, and the question was along this. Please concisely share your thoughts on goals of worship, or what I meant by that. Well, the operative word there probably is concisely, which I won't do. But I do think it's a good question, and I think it deserves a little bit of consideration, so I want to do that. In the Old Testament, the primary word for worship is shaka, and it means to bow down. In the New Testament, the primary word is proskuneo, which means to kiss toward. There are some other words, Greek words, that are translated worship or carry the same idea. They're listed there, but The gist of what I want to get out of this slide is worship in its rudimentary form is to bow down and to show affection, reverence, and awe, kiss toward, if you will. So for me, worship is the reverence and devotion that we show towards something. And I said something because you can worship things other than God. Obviously, in the Christian worldview, that should be what the object of our worship is. But worship in its most basic sense is reverence and devotion, homage to something. Therefore, if I was to give you a definition of what I consider worship to be, it would be to honor, reverence, and homage in thought, feeling, and action to a being or thing, but specifically and supremely to a deity, and in Christianity, that is the God that we understand from the Bible. Sometimes we think of worship by its parts, but they are not necessarily worship per se. Obviously, our public worship service consists of songs, it consists of prayers, it consists of scripture, it consists of the Lord's Supper or communion, it consists of teaching and exhortation. And I think there is a biblical basis for the reason we do all of those. But we could do all of those and still not worship. Because worship is not only the action, worship is also the thought and the attitude that goes into it. There are a multiplicity of things that I think can kill or detract from our worship. I'm going to only list two. One of them is if our worship or if our activity that we are calling worship is man-centered rather than God-centered. And a lot of what people today call worship, I think, is probably man-centered. What do we get out of it rather than God-centered? God's place is to be at the center of our worship and at the center of our hearts. And if it is not, then I don't consider it to be true worship. Secondly, pragmatism. This concept of whatever works, we'll do whatever it takes to fill the building. That's a situation where God, not man, has determined what worship should be. And I believe worship is not for man, although there are benefits of worship for man. The focus of worship is God. We are called to a God-centered spiritual worship. I do not believe you can worship without, or you can't worship without emotion. Now, when I say we can't worship without emotion, that is different from emotionalism. I believe emotion should come from our reverence and homage to God. I don't know how you can truly reverence and place God where He ought to be and not have an emotional response to that, of thankfulness, of awe, of reverence. But that is different than having our emotions guide our worship. I believe our faith generates our emotion rather than our emotions generating our faith. I don't believe you can worship without reverence, because that's one of the essential aspects of it. I do not believe you can worship without sacrifice. Now, obviously, we don't sacrifice bulls and goats, but we sacrifice time, we sacrifice energy. Remember David said when he was going to wanted that land, I've got to paraphrase, I've got to pay for it because there has to be a sacrifice on my part. And sometimes we may try to worship without sacrificing much time, or much preparation, or much thought, or much energy. And when we do that, I question whether or not that is what the Lord is looking for. I do not believe we can worship without a pure heart. Psalms 24, I guess it could be verses 3 and 4, but you can read them in whatever order you want. But it's right there. I'm not tired. And it talks about worshiping with a pure heart. So what's the answer to the question? Well, the answer is never as explicit as you would like, nor for some of you as concise as you would like. But I thought William Temple did a fairly good job when he talking about worship says, it is the submission of all of our nature to God. It is the quickening of conscience by His holiness, purifying our imagination or thoughts by His beauty, opening of the heart to His love, and submission of the will to His purpose. All this gathered up in adoration is the greatest expression of which we are capable. He says it's a response to the holiness of God. It's the purification of our thoughts because of the beauty of God. It's the opening up of our heart to His love, and it's the submission of our will to His will and His purpose. I'm sure we could fine-tune that, add to that, but I thought that was worthy of consideration. So I guess for me, worship is when the heart, will, conscience, imagination or thoughts, and actions all coalesce together. And when we do that, then I think we can have unity within ourselves, and maybe most importantly, unity with God. And when you and I are united with God, then we are going to automatically be united one with another. It's like spokes in a wheel. When the spokes are properly aligned with the hub of the wheel, then the spokes will by definition be aligned with one another. There are various ways of worship. There is public worship. There is private worship. I do not think private worship can take the place of public worship. That's why I can't go on a vacation and with my family privately worship God on the Lord's Day and think that takes the place of assembling with the saints. But there is a place for both public and private worship. But I do exhort us to always remember that God has to be the primary audience and focus of our worship. Any activity that does not have God as the primary audience and focus, I don't personally consider that to be worship. Another question. What should be done if we feel discipline is not being administered where it is necessary? Should we speak to the elders first? I understand action is sometimes being taken that I may not know about or be in a position to follow. I made myself some notes on this card, so let me find it. Here it is. This sometimes happens, and I think, I don't know who this question is from, but I really like the last sentence. An understanding that, we may not know everything that's going on. In fact, as members of our congregation, there are many things that our elders are doing that we don't know about. We appreciate it, and it's not always appropriate for us to know about it. I listed a few passages here that you might want to consider. Some of these have already been referenced. I think John was referencing Matthew 18, where it says if you've got a problem with someone, you go one-on-one. If that doesn't work, you take 2 or 3 with you. If that doesn't work, you bring it before the congregation. For me, the principle there is, let's address these things at the lowest level possible with the fewest people involved that don't need to be involved. We don't tend to always do it that way. Maybe we don't even usually do it that way, but I think that is the biblical way. So in a case like this, if discipline is not being administered where it's necessary, if it is not known and you're the only person that knows this other person is having the problem, I think you should go to them first. Now, if it's a situation where it's known and it's maybe many in the congregation know about it, or maybe the elders know about it, and you just don't see anything happening, then I would say, go talk to the elders. They may be able to tell you, we're working on it. And if they tell you that, and you have confidence in them, which you should, then that's good. Let them handle it. However, maybe they're not aware of it. And maybe they're human. Maybe they could use a little encouragement and nudging or knowing that you're with them. Because this is not a fun thing to do. Maybe they could give you some guidance as to what you could do to help the situation. But I've gone to my elders on several occasions when I am aware of something and kind of said to them, hey, I don't want to mess up anything you're doing, but is there anything I can do to help, or is there any information that would be helpful to you? And sometimes they have something that would be good for me to do, and sometimes it's obvious to me They're on top of it, they're working on it, and we don't need 14 chiefs. We just need to make sure that it's being addressed. So, 1 Corinthians 5 is the young man maybe, or at least man who has some immorality in his life. I put that in there because we need to remind ourselves that when discipline in our midst is necessary, it is congregational discipline, not simply elder discipline. Yes, the elders may need to take a lead in that, or whoever has the leadership in your congregation. But we as a congregation are doing it, not just the elders or the evangelist, if you have an evangelistic oversight. In 1 Timothy 1, John has alluded to, is that 1 Timothy or 2nd? Anyway, the one I want is Hymenaeus, when they're delivered over to Satan. There's 2 times that phrase is used in the Scriptures. 1 Timothy 5, and then again 1 Corinthians 5, and then in Timothy, that kind of idea of turning them over to Satan. You want to talk about a sobering phrase, turning them over to Satan, but it's for, as has been expressed, not only for their good, but for the good of the congregation. I'll be happy to talk to any of you or whoever submitted this question in more detail if you would like, but those are my concise thoughts. Another question. How does the MDR, that's marriage, divorce, and remarriage for those of us whose fingers get tired. How does the MDR issue affect the ability to serve in the church? I understand that it eliminates the service of an officer, but does it disqualify in other areas as well? Can it appear that we are accepting sin by allowing their service? If I understand that question, there's really 2 or 3 questions there. I'm going to assume, because it doesn't make any sense if I don't, that we're talking about a situation where there's been a marriage, a divorce, and maybe a remarriage that isn't scriptural. If all of this is scriptural, then my answer is they should be used in any way they are capable of being used, at least in the service. Another side comment before I get maybe to the ultimate answer. The idea of it eliminating them as being a potential officer. This is an area of probably judgment to some extent. Obviously, if it's an unscriptural situation, obviously they are not eliminated. The question sometimes comes up, if a man has been divorced, has the right to remarry, and then remarries, is he automatically disqualified from being an officer? My feeling is it is probably unwise in most cases for that man to serve for several reasons. One of them being it may just be a constant question mark in people's minds. Usually there's more than, I use the phrase, there's usually dirt on both sides of the nickel, even though most of it may be on one side. So I think we need to be very, very careful. I have never appointed a man to the office who has been in a situation like that. I know of officers that we are in our brotherhood that are in situations like that, and I leave that to the judgment of whoever appointed them and their congregation. But the idea of just using an individual like this in the service, well, again, if everything was scriptural, I have absolutely no reason to not use them in the service. They're a brother or a sister teaching the classes, whatever it might be. Now, if it is not scriptural, I think things like that need to be addressed before anybody is used in the service. Whether it's MDR or whether it's drunkenness or whether it's fornication or immorality. I talked, it's been a few years, but a couple was concerned in their congregation because the person officiating at the Lord's table, obviously to them, had alcohol on his breath when he came to church. Well, we can discuss whether or not drinking is wrong versus drunkenness, but it would seem to me like that is not a very good precedent at all. And when we just turn our face to sin and continue on in our worship services as if everything is okay, to me that is problematic to be nice about it and wrong to be more accurate about it. So I think we need to be quite careful about that. I don't think it automatically, but I think if there is sin in the camp, that the sin needs to be addressed or the camp's going to suffer. And I would hope those that we use in a public way certainly are people who, to the best of their ability or our knowledge, have their lives in order. Now I could open this up right now and take the rest of the class. So I won't. I want to talk a little bit about the family. Families are nice. Families are wonderful. This is members of a family. They're happy. And probably for many, many reasons, they should be happy. Every family has some... Well, you just read it. And if it applies to you, I can say that I don't know who the weird one is in our family. Facebook, here we come. But Satan, seriously, and I think that last one was kind of serious, but it's funny. But funny things are usually funny because they have a smattering of truth to them, don't they? But Satan certainly is attacking the family. If I were Satan, and I'd say, how do I want to win? I'd say, go after the family, because that's going to affect our civil government, and it's going to affect the church. And I think he's attacking all of them, but he is certainly attacking the family. And there is not a family here that Satan does not or is not having an effect on. That's just an absolute truth. My family has issues. Your family has issues. I have issues. You have issues. So let's just be honest about it. There's probably not a family here that hasn't been affected by marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Maybe not you, and maybe not your closest kin, but you don't have to go very far on that tree to find it. That doesn't make it better. It just makes it that we're all in the boat. It's affecting our homes. It's affecting our marriages. It's affecting our parenting. It's affecting our children. But the principle still holds true. Only spiritual solutions can solve spiritual problems. And family problems are spiritual problems. That's just a fact. Now, if you're unemployed and having trouble supporting your family, I'm not saying that's because you're not spiritual. But the really important family problems they're spiritual. They're spiritual. So, it seems to me the solutions have to be spiritual. This has been talked about, but we're going to do it one more time. This is our societal hot button on marriage. And it's not right. I know it. You know it. But it is going to be something that those of us that live very much longer are going to have to deal with within the church, and certainly our children, our grandchildren are going to have to deal with it. I also want to give you a few scriptures. We've been reading press releases and all this, and not that these scriptures haven't been given, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, it's a list of sins, and one of them is effeminate. A male engaged in homosexual activity. And it's listed. Is it worse than any of the other sins? Well, it's not worse in the sense that all sin leads us to lost souls. But it does seem, at least in our culture, to be an issue that our young people and those of us that are older are having to struggle with. And I've come face to face with it, not in my family, but I've come face to face with it in my church work this last year, more than in the previous 20 years. And maybe that's just my sensitivity to it, or maybe it's catching up with us. In Jude, verse 7, there's a reference there to strange flesh. We've touched on this in Romans, where in Romans chapter 1, verse 26 and 27, it talks about women going to unnatural affections and men going to unnatural affections. That's what it's talking about. There are other passages, but I just wanted to make sure I gave some scripture for those of you that would like to consider it. There is no, and what I mean by that, there is no neutral zone on this issue. There is that 10-mile DMZ zone like we have in between North and South Korea. As Christians or as people, you've got to take a position on this. You can not think about it, but that's a position as far as I'm concerned. Jason Jackson, in one of his articles, says, God does not discriminate. All sin is horrible, as demonstrated by the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. Penitents are saved because their sins are forgiven, but others will die lost. Measure a society by what is considered normal, and ours is not unlike those tolerant cities of old, Sodom, Gomorrah, Corinth. Perversion is glorified. Sodomy is the way God made me. One proof of our degenerate world is the confusion over the anatomy of men and women and their compatibility. John Piper, there is no demilitarized zone on the issue of homosexuality. You can Google and read that article. I found it to be fairly good on it. But I don't think more press releases or even more scriptures are the issue. We just have to come to grips and stand for what we know the Bible teaches. So I asked the question,